Okay, so we've talked about transcription and what you need to do transcription, and I suggested that it was a good idea to use Pratt and see acoustic analysis while doing playback. Pratt gives you a lot of control. You can listen as many times as you want. You can select subparts, which can often be helpful actually, as you just say, well, was there something between this vowel and the consonant, and you can listen to just part of it and see exactly what's there, as well as seeing the acoustic information. If you don't have Pratt, go on to Google, search for Pratt, P-R-A-A-T, download it, install it, and then put your sound recordings of a child on the computer and open Pratt and load them into Pratt. So I'm just loading it in there. And I'm now going to select Read from File. Now I've more or less already got it lined up. And this time we're going to be working on Mandarin. I can unfortunately only load in one file at a time in this particular version, but we'll get them on and then we'll take a look at them. I myself do not know Mandarin, and so you can see the English translation as part of what we've got there. Okay. This is a Mandarin-speaking child, monolingual, and from Shanghai. And this child has protracted phonological development. The first word is the word for sun. The adult form starts with an aspirated T, followed by the diphthong I. The tone is a high falling tone. And then the second syllable starts with the approximate Y, has a simple vowel A, and ends in an engma and has a low tone. So let's listen. Okay, a bit loud right at the beginning. And that throws off the pitch tracker, actually, but you can see from the spacing out of the harmonics exactly what was going on. And it's starting with a very high pitch, which falls. And it's supposed to have a high falling pitch. So that part of it seems to be fine. In terms of the diphthong, if I just listen to the beginning, the timing seems a little strange, but indeed there is an E, short E-like vowel after a long ah kind of vowel. If we go back to the beginning, you can see a burst, and there's really not much aspiration. It almost immediately starts voicing. So what we've got here is a voiceless unaspirated T. So we've got deaspiration. The second syllable is supposed to have a low tone, and indeed, although the pitch falls during the production of the vowel, it is in fact a fairly low tone compared to what came before. The vowel is reasonably accurate at ah, although at the end here, as the pitch falls, it actually gets into a little bit of creaky voice. You can see, as you look up here, that the vertical striations get a little bit irregular. Does it begin with a Y? And the answer is not really. That's more of a nasal. Although the speakers I'm listening to actually aren't actually very good for this. So it's more of a nasal. There is no final nasal, so presumably this is a nasal. The final nasal, which is an engma, has been displaced and is showing up, combining with the y to create more of a nasal at that point. So what we've got is deaspiration. The tone is pretty good, and then we've got a problem with the final nasal, which has been coalescing with the y in medial position. Another thing with some stops, this is the word for cookie. Neither vowel neither consonant is supposed to be aspirated. It's supposed to start with an unaspirated p, and indeed it does. It should, in the second syllable, have an unaspirated k. Say, well, there's a little more space here. If I measure it, it's 22 milliseconds long, almost into the aspirated range, but not quite. So that's quite common cross-linguistically as well, a little bit more longer lag VOT in K than in P, so that probably works out acceptably. The vowel in the first syllable should be an E, and it is. It should be an A in the second syllable, and indeed it is. Notice that it ends, though, in a glottal stop, and there's no final nasal. There should be an N here. If we listen, though, the second half of this vowel is nasalized. The first half, I believe, is not. You can hear that's oral, and then it turns nasal. So the nasal consonant is gone, but the second half of the vowel is nasalized. Another thing you'll notice is that there is no nasal at the end of the first syllable. But we have a very, very long closure at 284 milliseconds, roughly. There's a little bit of voicing into closure here. So what we've got is the initial, the nasal in the coda of the first syllable disappears, and the K then becomes long. The final nasal here disappears, nasalizing the second half of the vowel. So you can see that this child doesn't really do coda nasals particularly, but the vowels are reasonably accurate. Now the pitch should be high falling in both syllables. And it isn't, or I'm sorry, mid falling in the first syllable and high in the second syllable. You can see it's actually somewhat similar in the two syllables. There's a bit of a wobble in the first syllable, but calling it mid falling is probably okay. But it looks like it's mid falling in the final syllable as well. It should have been a high tone. So here you see that the tone is not completely accurate, and it looks like the one tone has assimilated to the other. The third word that we're going to look at is another two-syllable word. All of these are either synchronically or historically compounds.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have, in fact, selected a monosyllable instead. This is the word meat. And it's described as having a roughly, in the adult pronunciation, a roughly English-like R sound, but perhaps not a rounded one, followed by the diphthong O, a fairly English similar O, and no final consonant. First thing you'll notice is that, in fact, it ends with glottalization, and potentially we'd want to call it a glottal stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Second thing is, there is no rounding on this vowel. We'd want to call this a baby gamma, a mid-back unrounded vowel. And lastly, the initial whatever it is here is not anything like an English R.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
What is it? Well, it's some kind of approximant. It's not totally clear what. As I look at the formants and listen to it, I'm inclined to say that it's the approximate equivalent of a barred I, which means that it's kind of on the cusp between the front half of the tongue and the back half of the tongue. The R uses the front half of the tongue. It's therefore a bit R-like, but doesn't actually meet the target particularly well. It's non-coronal, whereas it should be a coronal one. Listening one more time.
Yeah.
Okay, second thing, I do not have written down what the tone of this particular word is. I believe we'll come back to that. But notice that the pitch rises a little bit during the approximate, where it probably doesn't matter, and falls on the vowel. And as we come to the end of this, we'll look at the transcription, and I believe I have tone transcribed there. Our last form is the word for butterfly. Oh, nope, that was the word for cookie. Our last form is the word for butterfly. Now, this is described in the adult speech as starting with the voiceless velar fricative h, followed by an u, with a rising tone going from mid to high. It then has a voiceless unaspirated t and the diphthong ye in the final syllable with a rising pitch that's supposed to go from mid to high. We'll listen to that again. Okay, the first syllable indeed has a rising pitch, which goes from roughly the mid area of the child's pitch range to a much higher one. So the pitch seems to be okay. As it's gotten to the this final more higher amplitude thing, again, the pitch tracker has malfunctioned. I do not hear a falling pitch at that point. The oo is definitely an oo right here. This thing in front of it is kind of unclear. It's not a h for sure. It's voiced for sure. It seems to be something of an approximate, has a timing similar to the approximate we saw in the previous example. And I would transcribe it as a W that's not really moving very far. I'm not sure I'd write it as a full W as opposed to a superscript W, but one of the two. Let's listen to that again. Okay. Now the second syllable, the vowel matches the adult target. But listen to the tone. It's supposed to start mid and go high, and it does indeed start mid, but it drops. Yeah. And then it rises again. So that's mid, low, high, and that is a different tone. So the child has substituted a tone which is supposed to be a rising tone starting at the mid level for a different tone that starts at the mid level and ends with a rise, but has a fall in the middle. So it's a phonemically different tone. You may also notice that there's a burst followed by a bit of noise that's a bit louder perhaps than a typical aspirated stop. This is not supposed to be an aspirated stop, but listen again. The tongue body is quite high. There's a bit of frication there, and I would say that this is an alveolo-palatal affricate, and would use a superscripted C hook to do that. It also doesn't sound that voiceless to me, as opposed to I'd potentially say that it might be a D ring instead of a T, but I'm going with the T transcription. So here again we have some tonal issues as we've had on some of the previous ones. We have affrication. In one of the previous tokens we had de-affrication, so that's rather interesting. And we had the fricative turning into an approximate, which is another continuous sound. If we move now to the transcriptions, so these are the, I'm not actually sure if this is the noun meet or the verb meet, to meet. As you can see, okay, yes, on the word to meet, it was supposed to be a high falling tone, and it had a falling tone that could reasonably have been called that. So some of these things, issues, do you want to have a regular W or a superscript W, as I've got here? I don't think it was a full affricate, so I have it as an affricated element with a raised C hook. I have a true glottal stop here and a raised glottal stop there. Yeah, you could do them identically if you want. I also am not using IPA style for the tone here because I think that's often fairly difficult to read. I'm putting in more of a linguistic style, talking about high-low as the target, which was met, or mid-low again, which is the target that was met. I think that the Pratt screens at this point add a fair amount of information, but especially when you're dealing with something like this realization of the R, it definitely comes in handy, and it's very nice for those of us who come from languages which are not tone languages to be able to actually see what the pitch is doing and confirm whether the pitch is steady or rising or falling.